presentation. It's an introduction to you all of the various ways that you too as well can make DEI a priority for yourselves. So I'm going to first have Dr. Romero-Leggott introduce herself, and then I'll take a second to introduce myself.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smart. And again, yes, welcome and thank you all for taking the time and being part of this. I really want to give, both of us want to give a shout out to the Staff Council, Staff Success Committee, and EOD for really doing this really innovative, wonderful way for more professional development for everyone. We were very excited to have been invited and to be part of the process. And we know already that this is something that is of importance to you by your presence here today. So just thank you for that. I'm Val Romero-Leggott. I'm a native New Mexican Hispana, first generation college. My mom and dad are from Rancho San Cañon in up north in Taos. And really the work that I do and who I am and my values really come from me come from those values that they instilled in me and my siblings. So I just want to give honor to them in that. And again, our titles are all up here, but as Dr. Smart said, this is something that is just so very of core value to us and personally important to us. So again, welcome and just thrilled to be here. I serve, as you can see here, as Vice Chancellor for the Health Sciences Center, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I'm a family practice doc as well. So thank you.
Perfect, and thank you, Val. My name is Lindsay Smart, and I am a biracial woman. I identify as Black and Caucasian, and I have 2 young children who have various multiracial identities as well. And so I think from the personal side, that's not one of the titles that I have on here, but my role as parent and my role as a woman, I think, are various things that impact my investment in this work. I am a psychologist by background. I work with UNM student athletes, and I am up here at the School of Medicine side in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences clinically. And then I'm with the HSC Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with a very long title that is really related to faculty equity and inclusion efforts across the HSC. So a little bit more of a focus on the health professions on the North Campus. Okay, so I'm going to be moving our slides along with multiple screens. So let's see if everything cooperates with us. So we're going to start off with just a reading of our Indigenous Peoples Land and Territory Acknowledgement. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. And you can find more about our land acknowledgement through some various UNM web pages, and if folks are curious about that and haven't seen information about how they were developed and the purpose of those, please do let us know. You can put in the chat or email us afterwards today. And it's also something to think about when you do presentations nationally or even internationally. There typically is a land acknowledgement depending on where your presentation is given, depending on the land on which you may be presenting on. So just a little plug for considering that in future efforts for public-facing presentations as well. So our objectives, we have 2 objectives today because it's a short time, but these objectives are really foundational and can start really setting the baseline for where to go next with regards to looking at making DEI a priority. So one is a personal action step, really looking at taking the information from today and thinking about what it is that you might do with the information to make DEI a priority in your professional roles at the institution. The other objective is a little bit broader. It's really looking at the systems and increasing your awareness of what is this already with regards to some of the institutional activities that are going on to ensure that DEI is a priority for our institution as a whole, but also to think about where you could potentially bring things to the systems level to ensure that in your spheres of influence in the system, how you could make DEI a priority too. The punchline at the beginning, and then we'll unravel these things as we go through. And in order to make DEI a priority at both the individual and the systems institutional level are two primary things that we'll focus on today. First is really an understanding of how this work can be done is in aligning your DEI efforts with your own personal values. And we'll talk about what that might mean and why that might be a strategy to consider throughout today. And then the second part is to really consider the systems and how embedding DEI principles at all layers of our system, improving the ease of practice with regards to how DEI activities are able to be utilized, looking at resource allocation, ensuring that there is enough resources available to make those priorities a reality. Those are the two areas that we'll focus on today in our talk. This could be a whole summit. There's so many different ways to really look at DEI and making it a priority. So this really is serving as just an introduction for these. And so the first part we're going to do is we're going to take a look just so we're all grounded in the same way with some definitions. And I'm going to turn this part over to Dr. Romero-Leggott.
Thank you, Dr. Smart. We'll start with our diversity here, and really this whole idea that when we talk about diversity, we're really talking about acceptance and respect, right? And the idea that it is understanding that all of us are unique, right? And recognizing and celebrating the individual differences. And what we all know is that there is a spectrum, right? Many, many dimensions of diversity, and some of those are listed here. I won't read them all at this point, but again, the idea that we can come together and we can also explore and celebrate the differences in a safe and a positive and nurturing environment is what's really important to us. And that, again, it's not tolerating, but it's really embracing and celebrating these rich dimensions is our definition for diversity. And what's really important here, I think, too, is when we're talking about, well, how do we increase diversity, right? And it takes certain questions for us to ask questions and action as well, right? But how do we get more diverse people into our pipeline, right? What is that recruitment? What is that, and retention as well, right? But in the beginning, like, how are we? Like, how do we welcome people? What is our admissions and our hiring and the spectrum of how we bring people into our university? And then how do we incentivize recruiting diverse candidates, right? And so there's the incentivizing piece. There's also the piece of, do you go and do you know where to go to actually find diverse candidates, right? And so that piece is very, very important here. We've come to find out. And one of the things that we know is also one of the best ways to recruit people and get the word out is that just the personal, right? The networking and who you know and the places that that we work, we all have our connections. And again, that personal touch seems to really make a huge difference for us. And another question about why aren't people of different identities applying, right? Like we need to ask ourselves these kind of questions to start making a difference. Thank you. Next. And when we look at equity, we're going to just spend a little bit of time here on equity because I have to be very honest, before I started a lot of this work too, to me, equity and equality were really the same thing. I didn't really know the difference or anything, but here we're talking about the fair opportunity for everybody, right? Everyone to attain their full potential, right? And it doesn't matter regardless of your demographic, social, economic, geographic, that doesn't matter. What we want, and it's all about reaching your full potential and how do we make that happen, right? And you really need to ask and consider different things about, well, what are how do we engage people and ensure that certain marginalized identities do have that opportunity to not only grow, to thrive, to contribute, to develop, and do we really embrace and celebrate that identity that people bring? And our policies and practices and procedures applied in the same way for everyone, right? So we'll go to the next slide. And I don't know many of you, but I'm a very visual person. So when we were talking about the equity versus equality, both of us really like this graphic representation. But here, what you'll see in the, in the first image here, right? And all of these images, I have to say, were art inspired by Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree, right? So in the first imagery, you'll see like inequality, right? So it's unequal access to the opportunities, right? And an apple's dropping here on the left, while the person on the other right side is just kind of waiting and, looking up and wondering, well, okay, well, when am I going to get an apple here? And then if you look down to the next piece on the equality piece, it's really now equality is saying like, okay, all individuals get the same uniform treatment, resources, opportunities, so the tools and the assistance are the same. So, but what we know here, and you can see in this image, is both people now stand on the ladders, but the small person, because the tree's leaning to the left, the person on the right still does not have access, right? They're not able to access those apples. And I think one of the faulty assumptions here on that underlines equality is that everybody has the same identical needs, like a one-size-fits-all approach. And you don't take into account this idea that there are specific people and organizations and communities have specific needs and structural barriers and systemic issues, right? And then the third image, is where we're talking about equity. So you're doing proportionate distribution and access to these resources and opportunities that you see here. So this way you're accounting for the individuality and you're acknowledging that everyone isn't at the same place. There are historical underrepresentation of certain communities. So really you're looking again at now the person on the right has the taller ladder, you've made that difference, and then the person on the left, and you can both reach the apples. And what I love now, because there was always an equity versus equality, equity versus equality, and now we start talking about, and we'll get to a little bit later here too, the idea of justice, right? And really looking at those systemic issues and barriers and dismantling those as part of justice. So you're offering equal access to both the tools and the opportunities. So here, the tree's been propped up now with the supporting boards and it stands tree and tall and both people can access from ladders of the same height. So the idea of us really looking and getting to the justice part of things and making those systemic and structural barriers is really critical. Thank you. And then we'll take a really quick little, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation had a nice little YouTube that some of you may want to also use as well in some of your other talks or things. So Lindsay, can you click on that there?
I will try.
Okay.
Technology, we're going to give this a go. I think I'm going to have to.
Allie, Joseph, for embedding it correctly.
These days, we hear.
All right, I've got it pulled up. Let me move it to the other screen.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Do you see it?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, good. All right, let me start it over.
These days, we hear a lot of people using the word equity, but what does it really mean? It's not quite the same as equality, which means everybody gets treated the same. Equity is about fairness. It means that everybody gets what they need based on their own situation, because we're not all the same. The difference between equality and equity is important. It's part of the reason the United States spends more on healthcare per person than any other advanced nation and has much poorer health. It's important to remember that a person's health depends on many factors, things like their environment, schools, and workplaces, to name a few. We call these social determinants of health, like clean drinking water for children and easy access to fresh food. We can follow the lead of communities like Columbia Gorge in Washington and Oregon, where businesses, doctors, and farmers tackled the local hunger problem with the Veggie RX voucher program. And the New Jersey Partnership for Healthy Kids is bringing down high rates of obesity in underserved communities. We should be inspired by these local efforts and remember that health equity is all about making things better for all of us. When everyone's healthy, everyone benefits.
Thank you, Dr. Smart. And again, Allie, for making sure that that was going to work for us. Thanks.
Today we are talking about equity and equality.
Oops. Oh,
but you might be wondering, wait, aren't these the
I think
same
you're
thing?
still in the YouTube.
There we go.
Thank you.
Gone. It's gone.
I thought someone else had joined us.
That's true. That would have been a nice little drop in. Let me go to the next slide for you.
As you guys can tell, we're very fun and informal too. So also let us know if you want to just join us and talk. So the inclusion part of things is really very critically important. And before, it was really about diversity and equity. People spoke about all the time. But the idea that we really have a nurturing climate and a culture and an institution that really will foster what we were talking about, the respect and the belonging and the value for people and what you bring, right? What we all bring to the institution and to our communities. And I think what's really important here, like when you look at inclusivity, you're going to ask different questions, right? Like, well, what is the experience of everyone here? And especially people who are minorities within the organization. And then what barriers stand in the way of marginalized identities, feeling that they are welcomed and belonging. And I really wanted to make mention here too of the belonging part of things, because that is critically important. It's really about that essence, like that you feel that you can be your authentic self, that you're welcomed and you're celebrated so that you thrive, right? And you can, feel comfortable in contributing. When you're at the table, you see and you hear people like you. And, for us, it's about, a lot of times you think, well, what's our marketing? What's our marketing material? What's our website? Do we see ourselves reflected there, right? And those are really important. So again, with the inclusion and belonging, we know in the literature, I love this, inclusive teams make better decisions up to 87% of the time. They have calculated this, right? And if you follow inclusive processes, you make decisions actually 2 times faster and with half of the meetings, which I'm sure all of us could very much appreciate. And again, what we just know too is that when we make decisions and we bring people together that are diverse, that we deliver better results overall. Thank you.
This is our first part for questions. We kind of put some question opportunities in here. If there was any questions folks might have from the first part, definitions and whatnot, we can field those now.
I'll check in the chat. I don't see anything there. People can put them there or just speak out.
So far, nothing in the chat, but Bryn and I are here to read those aloud for you, or if you'd rather send them in a private message, we can always keep your name anonymous as well.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the opportunity to revisit a lot of these definitions. This is something that even when you're immersed in the work, I think is a really good thing to revisit as practitioners and as people who are looking to really gain capacity.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm always struck by the definitions too, because I feel like when I kind of got into graduate school, even just thinking diversity was it, right? It was cultural diversity. And the addition of equity and inclusion for me were just really stark realizations of how important it was to expand beyond just awareness that diversity exists. It's how to actually ensure that it happens.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it doesn't look like we've got any questions, but again, I will definitely let Dr. Smart and Dr. Romero-Leggott know if any come through.
All right, so the next part, what we're going to do is move into a slightly different part of the presentation, but obviously based on the foundation of those definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think in many ways, this approach of this part is actually looking a little bit more at the equity components of things along with the diversity and inclusion. So what I'm on this slide you see is an introduction to something that many of you might have seen in other maybe psychology courses, sociology courses. It comes up in biology, it comes up in ecology, it comes up in a lot of foundational courses that many folks might have had in high school, in college as well. And this is a approach that is probably most attached to Bronfenbrenner, and a social-ecological systems approach. It's not always used with DEI. I think we think of it a lot in my domain with psychology. We think of families and we think of systems and we think about how do you make changes work in that way. But it's more and more being looked at with regards to diversity, equity, inclusion in particular. Again, with that realization that the equity inclusion parts will require an interaction between various systems in order for change to actually occur. So I think as many of us are aware, an institution like UNM is incredibly complex. It has a complex governance structure. We have learners and staff and faculty, and all of those systems operate both independently and together simultaneously. And so this approach of thinking of DEI is assuming that all of those systems need to be engaged with in order for a system to make DEI a priority. And we are all part of the system as individuals. And so a key part of the social ecological systems is the individual layer of ourselves as well. And systems will work and operate regardless. The key here is a healthy system, a system that is putting DEI at play to ensure the health of our patients, the health of our students, the health of our staff and our faculty, and that's physical and behavioral health as well. All of those are the result of a system that is working well, and I would argue one that is putting DEI a priority is integral to ensuring that the system is healthy as well.
Wonderful. And Dr. Smart, just quickly before we move on,
Yes.
we do have some questions, and one that I think is highly aligned with this and one that you maybe be addressing later, but I'd like to just call your attention to them quickly. The first one is, I was struck by your use of spheres of influence. And the question is, how do you suggest that we approach leadership with DEI initiatives when we are not influencers?
Okay, so we will kind of touch on that
Sure.
a little bit, but just a little piece about that is that as individuals, we all have some sphere of influence that is operating around us in some way. I think that the question then becomes how much power are those spheres around us? And so I think one way that we look at spheres of influence is a systems level, but the other place is the individual level. When I go home, I hope I have some spheres of influence over my children. It's debatable, but there's those pieces. We have spheres of influence with our colleagues, with our friends. So sometimes I think it's thinking of the spheres of influence as not always assuming it has to be the biggest level, but that it's what's immediately around us that we might have some impact on, and starting there.
Wonderful.
I really appreciate that, Dr. Smart. It's very true, right? Again, like everybody has spheres of influence, I think is an important concept. And then the other part of that, and we'll talk about a little more, is the fact that it is incumbent upon the institution, right? We were just talking about inclusion and sense of belonging, and like, how do we do that to expand those spheres of influence as well, so that we have diversity at the table and people bringing their perspectives and experiences and everything to the table. So it is really, some of both, but always remembering, I think back to your point, Dr. Smart, is we all have individual spheres of influence in many ways. So thank you for that.
That's a good question.
Wonderful. And then the second one that we have is a question about, are there tools in addressing or combating inequality, exclusion, et cetera, as we had mentioned, and a question about how can I be a stronger ally?
Ooh, we could have a whole talk on allyship, which I think we've talked about. And I think maybe some of the next part might touch on that a little bit. I'm going to write it down just to be sure. because it is a little bit tied up in the individual sphere, being an ally. And when we look at the next slide, we'll have a little bit of a systems picture that might help also understand
Wonderful.
that. And I think sort of related to that and related to what Dr. Romero-Leggott touched on, the spheres of influence are related to relationships, and building those relationships in a professional setting are really integral in order for us to increase our spheres of influence as well. And it's a little bit tied to the allyship too.
Wonderful.
And then tools, I think I'll save that one for the end, because I think that might take us a slightly different direction, but there are definitely tools I think we can think about, including best tools, which are people like myself and Dr. Romero-Leggott to consult with and reach out to and think about.
And then finally, wrapping up the questions, I think around this section is a question about, is UNM intending to embrace the addition of belonging as an institution? So diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Great question. And I will tell you, there have been many a conversation on that as well. But I do think it's important. And it's something that we'll keep talking about, because before we were Office of Cultural Ethnic Programs in the way beginning in 2003, but we were then Office for Diversity, and it was Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, right? When all of these things, start evolving in this idea of belonging. So definitely things that we are evolving, and we will continue to look at these things. And, some of the other that have been put out, some of the other parts to the name have been, diversity, equity, inclusion, and community engagement, because community is so important to us, right? So I think that's a great question, and one that we will continue to have discussions on and with the greater community, and see if we would do that at some point in the future. So thank you for that question.
That's
wonderful. And that, I think, wraps up the questions that we had for this section, so Dr. Smart, I'll hand things back over to you. Thank you.
Perfect. Always appreciate the questions. Plus, it also gives us ideas on where to move things too. So thank you for those. So this is just a visual for folks to get an idea of when I'm thinking and talking about the social ecological systems, what I might be imagining in my head. I think there's a lot of different ways to think of systems, but the reason I like this visual is it shows how much the individual is related to all of the different concentric circles that you'll see. So the beginning part that we have at the center is ourselves. It's ourselves as people, and we have our own knowledge, we have our own bias, we have our own awareness, we have our own beliefs. Those come from our life experiences that we have had. The next layer that wraps around us is the interpersonal, which involves those who are not ourselves, but with whom we're in close contact. For many of us, that's going to be our family and our friends and our coworkers. We spend a lot of time at work. So I think that that's a very close concentric circle for us to think about in this system. Around that, we are individuals, and we work with people, and we all exist within some sort of organizational structure. This one is critical for thinking of our institution as a whole, because we have our UNM policies and guidelines and procedures. We have our UNM hiring networks. We have our own departments and divisions. All of those are aspects of our UNM organizational system structure. Our institution exists within a community. All institutions exist. We exist in the same community with our family and friends and coworkers that might live here at our institution that is housed here. And then we are in a relationship with Albuquerque as our surrounding area, but the New Mexico state as a whole. And that what happens in the community impacts our organization, which impacts our family, friends, and coworkers, and therefore impacts ourselves.
Yeah, and the point there, Dr. Smart, as you were saying about this concentric circles and the idea of, community, and that we all belong to so many different communities, right? Like there's no one, a lot of times, again, our identities or communities that, again, we are part of so many different parts of these. I
Yeah.
love this visual. It's great. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then we have this very large structure of the societals. This could encapsulate, I think, a few different things. It could be New Mexico, it could be our country, it could be east, west, north, south. I think that it really what it's saying is this broader aspect of our systems that might impact our laws, how systems might work, how we're all taught, how different aspects of our day-to-day life might operate are all filtered through, I guess, in many ways, our national system. So that's a visual for folks to have. And what we're going to focus on for this first part is the individual level. So just sort of highlighting here that we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about at the individual level, how might I or you and us together be able to make DEI a priority for ourselves. And then the second part, we're going to jump to the organizational structure and look more specifically at our organizational system. Okay, so making DEI a priority, I think it's very important. The title of this slide, I think, is if almost I wanted to make that the entire thesis, is that we are not all starting from the same place. There is no start line and there is no finish line. We are all going to be doing this and doing this and doing this and reprioritizing the more and more we learn about diversity, equity, inclusion in our world and those who may be like us or may not be like us. And the individual priority component, I think it's important for us all to acknowledge to ourselves and to each other that it's okay to not have all the answers, to not know what we're doing, and to start. It's just being able to start, and it's okay where we are at. And this quote that comes after the title is really trying to center this on, I think that we often are thinking about the changes that we want to see around us. And sometimes the hardest place to look to start that is ourselves. And so the focus of the individual micro level of change in a social-ecological system is to really turn to ourselves and see how might I want to change or do something differently. So as a psychologist, I turn to this more, and this is a model of change that is utilized when that something is hard to change or hard to know where to start. And this is a model that is largely known as the trans-theoretical model of change. But it's really and the next slide will tell you a little bit more specifically about what that is, but it's this idea of grounding that change is a continuous process. You might move up and down different levels of the change process at any given time. And that the activities that you engage in to make DEI a priority really do need to match what level of change you might be at in order for them to be most successful for you.
And Dr. Smart, I really, again, appreciate this idea of everyone thinks about let's change the world, let's do all these big things and everything, but it does start with us. And even as we think about it, many of us have done a lot of the implicit bias training and we look at that too. It really starts with us and looking at ourselves and how we are impacting that. And then again, I think this goes back to that whole thing, the spheres of influence and everything, but how powerful each of us as individuals can really make these changes. Thank you.
Absolutely. I love that point. So here's a rough outline for you all of what these stages of changes are. And I think, there is lots of ways to think about change. I don't want you to think this is the only way to do this. It's really just one way that I've started to think about it myself and thinking about systems in general and myself in a system. So what you have here is you've got some 5 stages of change. Now they're listed hierarchically, but this is a cyclical model. So once you get to the end stage, it's a matter of going back and forth through all of these at any given time. So we've got pre-contemplation. This is the idea of there's nothing that I need to change. I don't need to change. I don't need to do anything different. I was using this model a lot at pre-pandemic and thinking of like how to make it through the pandemic, I needed to have French fries. And I was like, it's probably not the best healthy option to make every Friday to end my week with French fries. But, I had no need to change. Everybody was stressed at that time, right? So we take what we can to make it through a long of not needing to change isn't always necessarily that you don't want to change. It's just a matter of there's nothing perhaps that might have given me a reason to want to change things a little bit differently. So contemplation, we get towards the end of the pandemic. Hopefully we're near that point, and it's like, okay, so maybe there's something that I could do differently. I'm not 100% sure, but that there's something that I have noticed either in myself or around me that is giving me some signs that maybe I shouldn't have French fries every Friday afternoon. I'm still a little bit ambivalent because I really like French fries, but I am still, starting to think about it. Preparation would be the next point. That's that I'm decided I'm going to do it and I'm going to make a plan. I've intended to do it. I may have started it 100%, but I've started to indicate ways that I could do this and make some changes. Action is doing it. I've engaged in my plan and I've modified it in some way. And maintenance is how do I keep this going? Because the pandemic isn't the only stress. So how do I manage a plan of change when the world will constantly sort of be stressful? And that sometimes goes back to pre-contemplation again, or it might just go back to the preparation stage where you readjust your plan. So in thinking about this with DEI is what the next few slides will really think about. And so pre-contemplation in a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging sort of sense might be that you're comfortable with the way things are, and perhaps there is no significant reason for you to feel like something might need to be changed. And going back to the last slide, maybe that's okay for whatever is happening for an individual in their life at this point. Contemplation is maybe you started to see some things in ourselves, in our spheres of influence around us, in our families, in our systems, in our communities, that have given you some sense that maybe something actually does need to change. You're not exactly sure what that might be and what that might be for you, but you want to maybe start to change something. Preparation would be the point where you get to the end of this presentation and you've made your action step and you've made an intent to change something. That's a really ambitious goal for the course of a 50-minute presentation, but just an example. And then action would be putting that into place, and maintaining it is keeping it going. All of these are individual level pieces, but they do involve the systems as well. Change cannot happen alone. You need our family, we need our friends, we need our colleagues in order to support the change process.
I really appreciated Dr. Smart in here too, a couple of the points. I love, again, the stage of change, right? We use this in family medicine, right? Anytime we're kind of doing behavioral things, or do you want to quit smoking? Do you want, different ways. And I think we actually all use this in different ways. Like we do this, but we maybe didn't have the terminology for it or understand the sequencing of the changes. And what I appreciate is that, again, what you said in the beginning, somewhere in that part, is that we're a lot of times in different places here, right? And it doesn't always go sequentially, right? And you jump from thing to thing. So I really appreciate, again, having the terminology, kind of understanding the great examples that you had. To understand that, but then knowing that we'll be in different places and different aspects, and we can be going back and forth in this, but just really understanding again that that just depending where you are and how important things are to you and where you are just in your life and in your work, you might be in different stages of this. So yeah, thank you for, again, explaining that and giving the great examples. That was
absolutely. Everybody's going to want French fries after today.
I know. Well, I wanted them now.
I guess I should disclose I have nothing to do with the French fry industry. Okay, so the first part of change is this word in red here is trust. And even though change happens at the individual level, it is reliant on trust in some way. And so if we're bringing the making DEI a priority to our system, specifically as ourselves as an individual, we also need to ensure that our system is creating an environment where we can trust that if we make DEI a priority, that it's something that will be supported. Because the first step in change is creating that environment. And I'm going to skip the second point and come back to that, because a lot of creating the safe place, and we think about our spheres of influence, is really related to this second point here around how do we ourselves around us create this safe and supportive environment. And I think thinking of our spheres of influence, this is probably the best place to start. But it's also this respect for individual autonomy. That goes back to the slide that says that everybody is not starting in the same place. And it goes back to the fact that if somebody is pre-contemplative and isn't quite ready to know what it is they might want to change with regards to making DEI a priority, change won't happen by forcing it. You have to also enlist the process with individuals as well. So the cultural humility and how that plays a role in building trust. We have a definition here, but I think in summarizing this idea of humbleness and openness and curiosity are the heart of our cultural humility, in creating a space where somebody can come and you can listen and they can feel heard. And being heard isn't always the same as change happening. But I think if you go back to the definition of belonging, it's pretty essential to that. It's hard to feel like you belong somewhere if you don't feel like you have actually been heard. And I think that creating an environment where that can happen is critical for all the layers of our systems. But if we're looking at just this individual level of making DEI a priority, it's one actionable step that we can all do around us with my children, with my colleagues down the hall. How do I create this space where somebody can come and feel heard? Another piece for the individual level is motivation. And that's the critical piece of thinking about how do you move with those levels, right? They're not stagnant levels. How do you move between them, between pre-contemplation to contemplation to action to maintenance, preparation, action, maintenance? It's a matter of some motivation. And a lot of times, some of that motivation that comes in interpersonally is what we call this decisional balance. It's something tips things slightly in a direction that they weren't tipping before, that leads you to take some first steps for preparation. This happened at a large scale across the country, I think, with the use of social media and live footage of events that were happening was a decisional balance for many individuals. Something that they heard about was different when it was something that they saw. And those were some things that slipped into making the motivation and sort of the action that started to happen across many institutions, including our own. The other piece of motivation, which the next few slides will focus on, is that it's much easier to find intrinsic motivation when we understand our own personal core values and align our change and action steps with those. It makes the process of change easier and something that is likely to be sustained, which is a key component of making DEI a priority for ourselves and our institution. It's not a matter of doing it just right now. It's a matter of doing it over and over and over again. And when things align with what we believe in and our values, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what that might mean in a very broad sense, it's much easier for those change processes to happen. So how do you do this? How can you do this? It involves lots of reflection in many cases, and it goes back to that first quote, is many people would want to change the world, but they don't want to start with themselves. Focusing with ourselves requires a little bit more of an internal dialogue, and turning ourselves sort of the mirror towards us to seeing like, what is it that we can do and what is my why? Why do I do this? Why am I part of this system? Why does the system do things this way? And what are my values that are driving why? my connections, and the patterns that I might see around me and myself and in others as well. So asking these questions of ourselves and then ultimately of each other and of our system will allow us to make some of those innovative connections to understand how we can make DEI a priority. It helps us to see patterns, helps us to think outside the box when we're engaging this cultural humility and in using that within our spheres of influence with our colleagues, where new ideas that maybe weren't shared before suddenly become more present and can impact ourselves as individuals, but can also impact our systems.
And I think one of the points as well in here that you also alluded to, again, the core values, how important that is in this whole process. But, when you look at things, it's our individual core values, of course, too, but then it's the institutional, right? And how do those align, I really think brings into play a lot of what we're talking about today in terms of asking the questions and having a voice and feeling like that you belong and that you, and that people are included, right? And so the fact that, when core values of your workplace really align with your own core values is really where we make the most strides. I believe, and again, to this intrinsic motivation, critically important. But again, I think, as a lot of times we're looking for jobs, students are applying for programs, different people at different points in their careers, just so critically important to really, as much as possible, really align those core values, because therein is where you will find really like that sense of belonging and appreciation for the place that you work. Mm-hmm. And others with, right, a lot of times with your similar core values, like we share those when we come to places.
Absolutely. Thank you. So this slide is an example of an activity. We're not going to do the activity today. It's one that if folks are interested in it, please do reach out afterwards and send me an email. It's also one that I am pretty sure our UNM HR system has implemented at different meetings and group events. It's known, at least I know it as the value card sort activity. It often goes along with the stages of change model as a way to look at motivations and why somebody might want to take some initial steps towards changing. This is not an exhaustive list of values by any means, but there are a few examples that are in if you search this online, you'll find some little cards. Essentially what you do is you go through and you find, first you identify like your first top 20, you go through and you engage in some sharing and small group activities, then you maybe narrow it down to the next 10, and then you ultimately land with about 5 core values. If it's really hard, you might be able to get 8. And the purpose of this is to really hone in on what it is that makes life and things meaningful for you. I think it's at the heart of a values card sort. When thinking about how to use this with DEI, social justice, all those sorts of activities, I can use one example, is if I think of a value that I hold near and dear to my heart is also family. And if I'm thinking of my family in the course of my work, my children in particular, and I'm working in a system, and I want my children to go to school in this system, let's say UNM, for example, that allows me to say, prioritize, is this system that I'm working in, what can I do to ensure that this is a system and an institution that I would want and have my children go to school in? And if it's not matching up in some way, that's that decisional balance, that tipping point. There's my little window of change. It's saying, okay, I see that I want my children to go to college here, and I'm feeling this piece isn't matching, that I wouldn't want my child to experience that. So that's something that I might want to change, whether that's the curriculum or availability, whether that's faculty representation, whether that's clubs, activities, the way that students are admitted. It could encapsulate all of those different things, but I'm starting with my drive of being my family and a value that I want my family and my children to feel respected and welcome and belong in whatever environment that they might give. And so that's just a very quick example of how we can utilize our own values to drive those little decisional balances that find the places in our lives individually that we might be able to change. And then that engages the rest of the system and our spheres of influence, but it's that spark that gets us going.
And this is an amazing, just an excellent activity. We did it for our DEI, our office advance. And it was, you know, we really think we know them. Talk about like that self-reflective piece. But as you get the smaller and smaller and you're doing that, oh my gosh, it was hard in that way, but it was great, again, to really have you deeply thinking about your values. And again, at some point here, you're aligning and matching them with the institution, right? And hoping that these align with the institution, but a really wonderful activity to use in many different settings. I would highly recommend this for sure. And we have another one we don't have time today to talk about too, but one about identity and being able to really celebrate and share that with each other and with our colleagues. So hopefully we'll have another opportunity to talk about that another time. Thanks.
Wonderful. And Evelyn is just sharing in the chat that she did this activity for cross-cultural psychology class, and it was great for self-reflection.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Oh, thank you, Evelyn, for sharing that.
Absolutely. All right.
Oh my gosh, we're at 2 minutes.
I know.
I was just
Shoot.
about to give, so I've got about just 5 minutes left in our session, but looks like you all have that well in hand.
We're good. We are almost to the last few slides. So this one is really just an opportunity, and I believe the slides will be made available at some point. So then you'll have this information too. But these are some action steps that we can take at the individual level. We start with exploring our personal values. Those come through our life experiences, our family, our friends, and just our lived experiences. We reflect on our decisions. We understand what our sphere of influence that might be. It might be small, it might be big, and it might change throughout your career at UNM as well. And how can we use that change in our sphere to facilitate change in others? And then the documentation and vocally committing. A key part of an individual change model is that telling somebody is actually more likely to be something that you sustain. And so that's engaging that other level of the interpersonal system, that the more that we verbalize our commitment to these initiatives, the more likely we are to see it filter out to our spheres of influence, but also the more likely we are to stick to those changes ourselves. So the next one we're going to move into is this organizational institutional level, really taking a peek at what it is our system can and is doing with regards to looking at making DEI an institutional priority.
And I know we don't have a lot of time on this piece here. We'll kind of go through it a little more quickly than we had planned. But again, we're looking at these macro level questions, right? The institutional, and again, what are your organizations or your department or your division or your whatever in here? What are those values, right? We were talking about how they align, and really you question, you ask like, well, who benefits from the structures that are already set up here? Who might not be invited and part of the structure here or welcomed here? And again, the policies and processes are critically important, right? Like, how are those applied, and do we feel like they're applied equitably? And really questioning that and looking at that, I think, is critical. And I think when we had that visual of the socio-ecological model, and we talked about at the top, the societal and policies and practices really, of course, impact all of us. Next, thank you. Sorry, we are kind of flying through these a little, but we're happy to also come and talk again or finish the rest of the institutional piece of this. But again, the representative leadership, right? And I think somebody had asked about that, but who is at the table? Who is represented when we have meetings and conference calls and conversations? And do we have diversity at the table on our race, ethnicity, gender, other abled? I mean, all of these pieces of things, like who is at the table, knowing again that when we have those diverse perspectives, we are making the best decisions for this institution and for our workplace and our educational environments, right? I mean, we're educational systems. And again, I think this goes back to, again, the trust that Dr. Smart brought up before, and the fact that are we willing, and at what stage are we in to be part of this process? And when does the institution offer these opportunities for us to do this, right? Because it's not always a matter of, oh, we're ready to go, but it's like, well, go where and how can we be involved, right? And so again, and while again leading the conversations, I appreciated this piece here, like, how do we introduce people? Is it done in an equitable manner for that? And to really not generalize as we're running our meetings or having our conference calls and our committee calls, and really being very open to others' views and suggestions to continue to evolve and to be better. Next. Just wanted to go ahead and offer some examples to you of some ways that we feel the university and HSC are making some DEI a priority to you, right? So we have, I know there's been a UNM Diversity Council for many years that really speaks to so many of these issues, and many of you here are probably part of that as well. And we now have an HSC Inclusive Excellence Council that we put together, where for the first time ever, we have representation from across the entire health sciences together, so that we can not be siloed and work together and bring together better diversity. And also the idea of like inclusive excellence. So that means like how well, if we achieve inclusive excellence, it really depends on how well we include, engage, and value the communities that we serve. And the communities we serve both internally and externally, right? So that's learners and staff and faculty, administrators, alumni, parents, community members. Really important, to have our implicit bias training policy. Right now we have this for search committees, but this should be part of admissions trainings and all the touch points that we have along the way. Holistic admissions, do we look at the whole person, or are we looking only at cognitive and test scores, right? And data dashboards. If you don't know where we are, how do we know where we're going and the difference traveled, right? Like distance traveled there. And again, community engagement is so critically important. And then we have things like a guidelines for participating in peaceful protests. That was something important we wanted to make sure that we addressed this last year. So again, just some opportunities. I will tell you opportunities to become involved. We have a place on our website, and if you'd like to be involved with the Inclusive Excellence Council, please join the meetings that are open to the public as our Diversity Council, and ways that you can actually partake in that as well. So I know we're past our time.
Yeah, well, this is the last slide, so we just finished it. And really, it's just an acknowledgement. This work is hard. It's exhausting. It takes a lot of energy until we sort of also work on aligning resource allocation to it. It's often on top of folks' already expected duties. But that there's a recognition that the work that sometimes you're doing may not be for yourself, but somebody will benefit from this, and how important that is for us to recognize that in our role as making DEI a priority at the institution. So.
Excellent quote.
I think that's the last slide there. Wonderful. With our email. And the survey, did the survey go out in the chat?
I will put the survey in right now. Although actually, maybe what I'll do is I'll send that an email, and we'll hold this space if anybody, and Dr. Romero-Leggott, excuse me, and Dr. Smart, if you have a few moments to stay on, if anybody does have any questions, I'm happy to leave. I'm happy to leave the session open, and we will send out that evaluation a little bit later on. But I know I speak for everyone in the chat. Thank you so much for such an informative presentation.
Thank you, and I appreciate Patricia Gomez in the chat said, in order to make DEI a priority, people need to utilize their privileges and worldly experiences to come together. Really well said, and that is so true, right? Like, we do need to utilize our privileges in that aspect.
Absolutely.
And I think that gets to that last quote, right? Like, we're not only impacting ourselves, but many others around us and those to come, right? Like those who will be following. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Patricia, really appreciate it.
Other questions folks might have. And of course, you can find us at any point. We're always open for questions, and our emails are easily available on the webpage, but you can also